In a quiet little neighborhood where the streets were lined with trees and the air always smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, life moved at a peaceful rhythm. The Anderson family lived in a cozy two-story house painted a soft shade of blue, with white shutters framing the windows. Their home wasn't the fanciest on the block, but it had warmth, something that came from laughter, love, and the lively energy of three children who filled every corner with joy. Sarah Anderson, a kind-hearted woman with a warm smile, spent her days juggling work-from-home tasks while keeping an eye on her kids. Emma, Liam, and Sophie. 10-year-old Emma was the artist of the family, constantly sketching pictures or creating colorful chalk drawings on the driveway. 8-year-old Liam loved soccer more than anything else. His ball was never far from him, and he practiced kicks whenever he could find space. Little Sophie, just 5 years old, was full of curiosity, chasing butterflies or picking dandelions to make bouquets for her mom. Every afternoon after school, the kids would rush outside to play. They'd laugh as they ran around the yard, their voices carrying through the crisp autumn air. Sometimes, they'd draw hopscotch grids on the sidewalk or race each other to the end of the street and back. Sarah always kept one eye on them, either peeking out the window or sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. She believed letting her kids explore and have fun outdoors was important. It taught them independence, creativity, and how to appreciate nature. Most of the neighbors liked the sound of children playing. It reminded them of simpler times when life wasn't so busy, and kids roamed freely without screens glued to their hands. But not everyone felt the same way. Across the street lived Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman whose neat garden and spotless house stood in stark contrast to the lively chaos of the Andersons' front yard. Mrs. Harper had lived alone for years, ever since her husband passed away. Her days were quiet, almost too quiet, and over time, she grew irritated by what she saw as disorder next door. To Mrs. Harper, the sight of Emma sprawled on the driveway drawing with chalk, Liam kicking his soccer ball near the curb, and Sophie twirling in circles like a tiny tornado was unsettling. She thought it was messy, noisy, and most importantly, unsafe. How could Sarah let her children run around unsupervised? Didn't she know the dangers of the world? Every time she looked out her window, her frustration grew. She muttered under her breath about how parents these days didn't care enough, shaking her head disapprovingly at the scene outside. But what Mrs. Harper didn't realize, or perhaps refused to see, was that the Andersons weren't neglectful. Far from it. Sarah checked on her kids regularly, made sure they stayed safe, and encouraged them to enjoy their childhood. To the Andersons, this was normal. To Mrs. Harper, it seemed reckless. And one fateful day, unable to contain her irritation any longer, she reached for her phone and dialed a number that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Detective Laura Hayes returned to her office, her mind buzzing with questions. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still gaps that needed filling. Mrs. Harper's behavior during their conversation had been telling. Her sharp tone, her reluctance to engage directly with the Andersons, and her history of filing complaints against neighbors painted a picture of someone who wasn't just concerned about the children's safety. Something deeper was at play, and Detective Hayes was determined to uncover it. She opened her laptop and pulled up the file on Mrs. Harper. The anonymous tip about animal hoarding stood out like a neon sign. It described an overwhelming number of cats living in unsanitary conditions inside her home. At first glance, it seemed far-fetched. How could such a meticulously tidy woman harbor dozens of animals? But Detective Hayes knew better than to dismiss anything outright. Hoarding often masked itself behind facades of control or perfectionism, especially when viewed from the outside. To confirm her suspicions, she decided to pay another visit to Mrs. Harper's house. But this time, she wouldn't go alone. She contacted Animal Control and arranged for a welfare check, ensuring they'd be ready to intervene if necessary. As she drove back to the neighborhood later that afternoon, her stomach tightened with anticipation. This wasn't just about clearing the Andersons anymore. It was about helping someone who might desperately need support. When Detective Hayes arrived at Mrs. Harper's front door, she knocked firmly. After a moment, Mrs. Harper answered, her expression darkening as soon as she recognized the detective. Again, she snapped, clearly annoyed. "What more do you want?" "I'm here to follow up." Detective Hayes replied calmly, stepping closer. "There's been additional information brought to my attention regarding your household. May I come in?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. For a split second, Detective Hayes thought she might refuse, but then the older woman stepped aside reluctantly. "Fine," she muttered, leading the way into the living room. The moment they entered, Detective Hayes noticed something different. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, and a faint smell lingered beneath the surface, a mix of ammonia and dampness. Her gaze swept across the room, landing on what appeared to be cat carriers stacked haphazardly in the corner. A low hum of mewing filled the silence, growing louder as they moved deeper into the house. "Mrs. Harper," Detective Hayes said gently, "can you tell me how many pets you currently have?" Mrs. Harper stiffened, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "A few," she said curtly. "Why does it matter?" "It matters because we received a report suggesting there may be more than a few," Detective Hayes explained. "We're here to ensure everything is safe, for you and for the animals." At that moment, 2 members of the animal control team arrived, carrying supplies and wearing gloves. Mrs. Harper's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, raising her voice. "You have no right to invade my privacy." "We're not trying to invade," Detective Hayes assured her, keeping her tone steady. "We're here to help. If there's nothing wrong, then we'll leave, and that will be the end of it. But if there are concerns, addressing them now can prevent bigger problems down the road." Reluctantly, Mrs. Harper allowed them to proceed. What they discovered was both heartbreaking and overwhelming. Dozens of cats roamed the house, some appearing malnourished, others visibly ill. Cages lined the walls, overflowing with litter boxes and food dishes. The once pristine floors were stained, and the air was thick with the scent of neglect. Despite the chaos, Mrs. Harper seemed oblivious, or perhaps unwilling, to acknowledge the severity of the situation. As the animal control officers worked to assess the animal's condition, Detective Hayes turned her attention back to Mrs. Harper. The elderly woman sat rigidly on the couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Tears welled in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I don't understand why everyone is ganging up on me," she whispered bitterly. "I take care of them. They're my family." Her words struck a chord with Detective Hayes. Beneath the frustration and defensiveness lay loneliness and pain. Mrs. Harper wasn't a villain. She was someone struggling to cope, using animals as a substitute for connection and purpose. It was a cry for help disguised as stubbornness. With compassion in her voice, Detective Hayes knelt beside her. "Mrs. Harper, I know you love these animals, and I believe you've done your best to care for them. But sometimes, even the people with the biggest hearts need support. Let us help you find a solution that works, for you and for them." For the first time, Mrs. Harper didn't argue. The call Mrs. Harper made wasn't to a friend or even another neighbor. It was to Child Protective Services, an agency responsible for ensuring the safety and well-being of children. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke into the phone, but her tone carried conviction. She described what she saw: kids playing outside without proper supervision, running around like wild animals. She insisted that this behavior was dangerous and unacceptable, painting a picture of neglect that didn't quite match reality. When asked if she had spoken to the Andersons about her concerns, Mrs. Harper hesitated before admitting she hadn't. After all, why bother talking to them when they clearly weren't going to change? On the other end of the line, the CPS operator listened carefully, taking notes as protocol required. Complaints like this weren't uncommon, though many turned out to be misunderstandings or exaggerations. Still, every report had to be investigated thoroughly. By the time Mrs. Harper hung up, she felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. Satisfaction because she believed she'd done the right thing by reporting the Andersons, and unease because she knew her accusation might stir trouble in the neighborhood. But she pushed those thoughts aside, convincing herself that someone needed to step in. Within hours, a black sedan pulled up to the curb outside the Anderson home. Detective Laura Hayes stepped out, adjusting her jacket against the cool breeze. She was a seasoned investigator with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. Years of experience had taught her to approach cases without jumping to conclusions, no matter how serious or seemingly trivial the complaint might be. As she glanced toward the Anderson house, she noticed the kids were still outside, laughing and playing just as Mrs. Harper had described. Emma was sketching colorful patterns on the driveway with chalk. Liam was kicking his soccer ball gently against the side of the garage, and Sophie was spinning in circles, her giggles ringing through the air. Detective Hayes paused for a moment, observing quietly from a distance. What she saw didn't align with the image Mrs. Harper had painted over the phone. The children seemed happy, healthy, and engaged in typical kid activities. Their mother, Sarah, occasionally peeked out the window or called out reminders to stay safe, her presence evident even from afar. Something about the scene felt warm and familiar, not neglectful or chaotic. Still, Detective Hayes knew appearances could be deceiving. It was her job to dig deeper and uncover the truth. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the driveway and knocked firmly on the door. Moments later, it opened to reveal Sarah, who looked surprised but welcoming. "Can I help you?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. Detective Hayes introduced herself, flashing her badge briefly before explaining the reason for her visit. "I'm here following up on a report regarding your children," she said evenly, watching Sarah's expression closely. Confusion flickered across Sarah's face, quickly replaced by concern. "A report? About my kids? Is everything okay?" Detective Hayes reassured her that this was simply standard procedure and that nothing had been determined yet. She asked if they could talk inside, and Sarah nodded, stepping back to let her in. As they moved into the living room, the sound of the children's laughter filtered through the open windows. Detective Hayes couldn't help but notice how cheerful and lively it sounded, a stark contrast to the grim allegations she'd received earlier that day. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that unraveling this case wouldn't be as straightforward as it initially seemed. Back at the station, Detective Laura Hayes sat at her desk, flipping through the case file one more time. The events of the day had been eye-opening, to say the least. What had started as a routine investigation into an overzealous neighbor's complaint had spiraled into something much larger, a window into the hidden struggles of someone who lived just across the street from the Andersons. Mrs. Harper wasn't just a nosy or overly critical woman. She was someone grappling with loneliness and perhaps even undiagnosed mental health challenges. Her actions weren't malicious. They were misguided attempts to fill a void in her life. Detective Hayes reviewed the notes she'd taken during her visits to both households. On one side, there was Sarah Anderson, warm, attentive, and devoted to her children. On the other, Mrs. Harper, isolated, defensive, and overwhelmed by the very animals she claimed to care for. The contrast between the two women was striking, yet it highlighted something universal: the human need for connection and understanding. As she sifted through past reports involving Mrs. Harper, a pattern emerged. Complaints about noise, unkempt lawns, and minor neighborhood infractions painted a picture of someone quick to judge others, but hesitant to engage meaningfully. It was almost as if Mrs. Harper used these grievances as a shield, deflecting attention away from her own vulnerabilities. But what truly stood out was the anonymous tip about animal hoarding. Detective Hayes knew that hoarding often stemmed from deeper emotional issues, such as anxiety, depression, or unresolved grief. In Mrs. Harper's case, it seemed likely that the loss of her husband years ago had left a gaping hole in her life, one she tried to fill with cats. Unfortunately, her inability to properly care for so many animals had created a situation that endangered not only them, but also herself. Determined to address the root cause of the problem, Detective Hayes reached out to social services. She explained the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Harper's case, emphasizing the need for compassion rather than punishment. This isn't about assigning blame, she told the social worker on the phone. It's about getting her the help she needs. If we approach this the right way, we can make a real difference. The next morning, Detective Hayes accompanied a team from social services back to Mrs. Harper's home. By now, most of the cats had been removed by animal control, and the house was beginning to breathe again, literally and figuratively. The smell of cleaning supplies replaced the oppressive odor of neglect, and sunlight streamed through windows that had long been blocked by clutter. Mrs. Harper looked smaller somehow, sitting quietly on the couch as workers moved around her. Gone was the sharp-tongued woman who had greeted Detective Hayes with suspicion. In her place was a fragile figure weighed down by shame and regret. A social worker named Clara introduced herself kindly, sitting beside Mrs. Harper and speaking in soft, reassuring tones. "We're here to support you," Clara said gently. "You've been carrying a lot on your own for a long time, haven't you?" Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for things to get this bad," she admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't know what else to do." Clara listened patiently, offering words of encouragement. Together, they discussed options for moving forward: counseling to address underlying emotional struggles, resources to manage grief and loneliness, and guidance on responsibly caring for pets in the future. For the first time in years, Mrs. Harper allowed herself to accept help. She agreed to meet regularly with a therapist and participate in a community program designed to combat senior isolation. As Detective Hayes watched the interaction, she felt a sense of hope. This case had uncovered pain and misunderstanding, but it had also opened the door to healing. For Mrs. Harper, for the animals, and ultimately, for the entire neighborhood. The truth had come to light, revealing not villains or victims, but people navigating their own complicated lives. And sometimes, all it took was a little empathy to bridge the gap between them. Detective Laura Hayes knew that to get a full understanding of the situation, she couldn't rely solely on Sarah's account or the anonymous complaint. She needed to hear from the person who had made the call. Mrs. Harper. The elderly woman lived just across the street, her house neatly tucked behind a row of trimmed hedges. From the outside, it looked almost too perfect, as if no one really lived there. Detective Hayes crossed the road, her footsteps crunching softly against the pavement, and approached the front door. She rang the bell, and after a moment, Mrs. Harper answered. Her expression shifted instantly from curiosity to defensiveness when she saw the detective standing there. "Yes," she asked curtly, folding her arms across her chest. Detective Hayes introduced herself again and explained why she was visiting. "I'm following up on the report you made regarding the Anderson family," she said, keeping her tone neutral. Mrs. Harper hesitated for a brief second before nodding stiffly. "Come in," she muttered, stepping aside. The inside of Mrs. Harper's home was eerily quiet compared to the lively atmosphere next door. Everything was meticulously arranged. No dust, no clutter, no signs of life beyond the furniture and decor. It felt cold, almost sterile. Mrs. Harper gestured for Detective Hayes to sit in the living room, where they faced each other across a coffee table polished to a mirror-like shine. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. "So," Detective Hayes began, pulling out her notepad, "you reported concerns about the Anderson children playing outside unsupervised. Can you tell me more about what you've observed?" Mrs. Harper straightened up, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's simple," she said sharply. "Those kids are always outside, running around like wild animals. No structure, no discipline. And their mother doesn't seem to care. They're left to do whatever they want." Detective Hayes nodded, jotting down notes, but keeping her skepticism in check. "How often have you seen this happen?" she asked. Mrs. Harper waved her hand dismissively. "Every day, practically all afternoon. Don't get me wrong. I think fresh air is fine, But these kids are too young to be left alone. Anything could happen. As the conversation continued, Detective Hayes noticed inconsistencies creeping into Mrs. Harper's story. When asked whether she'd ever spoken directly to Sarah about her concerns, Mrs. Harper hesitated. "Well, no," she admitted reluctantly. "But I don't see why I should have to. It's obvious what's going on. Someone has to step in." Her tone grew increasingly agitated, and Detective Hayes picked up on subtle hints of resentment beneath the surface. "Do you interact with the Andersons regularly?" she probed gently. Mrs. Harper scoffed. "Not really. They keep to themselves, and frankly, I prefer it that way. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't speak up when something seems wrong." Detective Hayes listened carefully, piecing together not just facts but emotions. There was a bitterness in Mrs. Harper's voice, a sense of isolation that went deeper than mere annoyance over neighborhood noise. As the interview wrapped up, Detective Hayes thanked Mrs. Harper for her time and stepped back outside. Standing on the porch, she glanced toward the Anderson home, where laughter still drifted through the air. Something didn't add up. Back at her car, Detective Hayes pulled out her phone and did a quick search of past reports involving Mrs. Harper. What she found surprised her: multiple complaints over the years about various neighbors for loud music, unkempt lawns, even parking cars in driveways overnight. None of those cases had led to any actionable findings, suggesting a pattern of grievances rather than legitimate concerns. But one detail caught her attention: an anonymous tip alleging animal hoarding at Mrs. Harper's residence. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. The sterile appearance of the house, the lack of warmth, the tension in Mrs. Harper's demeanor, it all pointed to something bigger lurking beneath the surface. Detective Hayes realized that while the Andersons seemed to be innocent victims of misplaced frustration, Mrs. Harper might be dealing with issues of her own. This wasn't just about kids playing outside anymore. It was about understanding the complexities of human behavior and finding a way to address everyone's needs fairly. With renewed determination, Detective Hayes decided to take the next step, to dig deeper into Mrs. Harper's world and uncover the truth hidden behind closed doors. Detective Laura Hayes followed Sarah into the Anderson home, her eyes scanning the space as she stepped inside. The living room was bright and welcoming, with sunlight streaming through the windows and casting golden patterns on the carpet. Toys were neatly tucked away in baskets, books lined the shelves, and family photos adorned the walls. Snapshots of birthdays, vacations, and everyday moments that radiated warmth. It wasn't spotless, but it didn't need to be. The house felt lived in, like a place where life happened joyfully. Sarah gestured for Detective Hayes to sit on the couch, offering her a cup of coffee or tea. "Thank you," the detective replied politely, accepting a mug of steaming tea. She took a moment to compose herself, knowing how intimidating these visits could feel for families. "I want to assure you," she began gently, "that this is just a routine check based on a report we received. Nothing has been decided yet, and my goal is to understand your situation fully." Sarah nodded, though worry still lingered in her eyes. She sat across from Detective Hayes, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "What kind of report?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. Detective Hayes explained that someone had expressed concerns about the children playing outside without sufficient supervision. As soon as the words left her mouth, Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Playing outside? That's what they're worried about." Detective Hayes nodded, maintaining her calm and professional tone. "Can you tell me more about your daily routine with the kids?" she asked. Sarah leaned forward slightly, eager to explain. "Of course," she said. "After school, the kids come home, have a snack, and then head outside to play. I always keep an eye on them. They're either within sight of the house or close enough that I can hear them if they need me. We believe it's important for them to get fresh air and exercise. They love being outdoors, and honestly, it keeps them happier and healthier." As Sarah spoke, Detective Hayes listened intently, jotting down notes in her small notepad. Everything Sarah said sounded reasonable and thoughtful, far from the neglectful behavior Mrs. Harper had described. Still, the detective probed further, asking about mealtimes, bedtime routines, and how the children spent their weekends. Sarah answered each question confidently, sharing stories of family game nights, weekend hikes, and art projects that kept the kids busy and engaged. At one point, Sophie wandered into the living room, holding up a dandelion bouquet. "Look, Mommy," she chirped, her face lighting up with pride. Sarah smiled warmly and thanked her daughter, tucking the flowers into a jar on the side table. Detective Hayes watched the interaction closely, noting the bond between mother and child. There was no tension, no sign of distress, just genuine affection. The detective also asked permission to look around the house, which Sarah granted without hesitation. Together, they walked through the rooms, starting with the kitchen, where dishes were drying on a rack and a fruit bowl sat prominently on the counter. Next came the bedrooms. Emma's was decorated with drawings and stickers. Liam's featured posters of soccer stars, and Sophie's walls were painted a soft pink, dotted with stuffed animals. Each room was tidy but personalized, reflecting the personalities of its occupants. By the time they returned to the living room, Detective Hayes had formed a clearer picture of the Anderson household. What she saw, a loving mother, happy children, and a nurturing environment, didn't match the complaint she'd received, yet something nagged at the back of her mind. Why would someone make such a claim if there wasn't at least some truth to it? Or was this simply a misunderstanding fueled by differing opinions on parenting styles? Detective Hayes thanked Sarah for her cooperation, promising to follow up once she completed her investigation. As she headed back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. And while the Andersons seemed innocent enough, the person who had made the complaint remained a mystery, one that needed solving before any final conclusions could be drawn. The transformation at Mrs. Harper's house was gradual but undeniable. Over the next few weeks, Detective Laura Hayes kept tabs on the situation, ensuring that both Mrs. Harper and the animals received the care they needed. Animal control had taken in dozens of cats, many of whom were underweight or suffering from illnesses. The team worked tirelessly to nurse them back to health, while local shelters helped find loving homes for those who were ready to be adopted. It was a massive undertaking, but the community rallied together, donating supplies and volunteering their time to help. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper began attending therapy sessions twice a week. At first, she resisted, feeling embarrassed and exposed. But as the weeks went by, she started opening up to her therapist about the loneliness that had consumed her after losing her husband. She spoke candidly about how the neighborhood had changed over the years, how families came and went, leaving her feeling like an outsider looking in. The cats, she admitted, had become her companions, her reason to wake up each morning. They filled the silence in her home, even if they couldn't truly replace human connection. Through counseling, Mrs. Harper also confronted the reality of her hoarding behavior. Her therapist explained that while her intentions were rooted in love, taking in too many animals without proper resources only led to harm, for both her and the creatures she cared for. Slowly, Mrs. Harper began to understand this, accepting responsibility for her actions without being crushed by guilt. "It's okay to ask for help," her therapist reminded her during one session. "You don't have to carry everything alone." As part of her recovery plan, Mrs. Harper joined a senior outreach program organized by the local community center. For the first time in years, she stepped outside her comfort zone, attending group activities like book clubs, gardening workshops, and coffee mornings. To her surprise, she found herself enjoying these gatherings. Neighbors she'd once dismissed as noisy or inconsiderate welcomed her warmly, eager to include her in conversations and shared experiences. Some even offered to check in on her regularly, bringing homemade meals or simply stopping by for a chat. One afternoon, Sarah Anderson knocked on Mrs. Harper's door, holding a plate of freshly baked cookies. She smiled nervously as Mrs. Harper answered, unsure how the older woman would react. "I just wanted to say thank you," Sarah said softly, "for letting us know there was more going on than we realized. We're glad you're getting the support you need." Mrs. Harper blinked in surprise, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for understanding," she replied, her voice softer than usual. I've been unfair to your family. I see that now." Sarah hesitated for a moment before continuing. "If you'd ever like to join us for dinner, or if you just want company, I'd love for you to come over. The kids would enjoy meeting you properly." For a brief second, Mrs. Harper looked hesitant, but then she gave a small, tentative smile. "Maybe someday," she said quietly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A bridge mended between two households that had once seemed worlds apart. Detective Hayes heard about the exchange later and felt a swell of pride. This case had taught her something important. People aren't defined solely by their mistakes. With patience, empathy, and effort, even the most fractured relationships could begin to heal. And as Mrs. Harper continued down her path of recovery, the neighborhood grew stronger too, united by compassion instead of division. By the end of the month, Mrs. Harper's home no longer smelled of ammonia or despair. Instead, it carried the faint scent of lavender candles and fresh air. A single cat, an elderly tabby named Oliver, had been deemed healthy enough to stay with her, providing companionship without overwhelming her ability to care for him. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mrs. Harper felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. And sometimes, that was enough. The Anderson family returned to their normal routine, but with a newfound awareness of the complexities surrounding them. Sarah often found herself glancing across the street at Mrs. Harper's house, noticing subtle changes that hinted at progress. The once perfectly manicured hedge now had a few wildflowers growing along its edge, as if even nature itself was learning to loosen up. Occasionally, Mrs. Harper could be seen sitting on her porch, sipping tea and occasionally waving when she noticed Sarah or the kids outside. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of healing. Proof that small gestures could bridge gaps that once seemed insurmountable. Emma, Liam, and Sophie didn't fully understand what had happened, but they noticed something different about their neighbor too. One sunny afternoon, while drawing chalk pictures on the driveway, Emma looked up and saw Mrs. Harper standing near her mailbox. Hesitant but curious, Emma walked over with a shy smile. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," she said softly. "I drew you a picture." She held out a colorful sketch of flowers in sunshine, her signature scrawled proudly in the corner. Mrs. Harper stared at the drawing for a moment, her lips twitching into an almost smile. "Thank you, Emma," she replied, her voice gentler than usual. "It's very nice." Encouraged by this interaction, the kids started making little efforts of their own. Sophie left one of her dandelion bouquets on Mrs. Harper's doorstep, while Liam kicked his soccer ball toward her yard less aggressively than before, sometimes even inviting her to watch him practice his kicks. These small acts of kindness didn't go unnoticed. Slowly but surely, Mrs. Harper began to see the children not as noisy nuisances, but as bright, energetic parts of the neighborhood fabric. Word of Mrs. Harper's struggles spread quietly among the neighbors, not through gossip, but through shared concern. People who had once dismissed her as cranky or unapproachable now reached out with offers of support. A few brought meals during particularly tough weeks. Others invited her to join holiday gatherings or community events. Even those who hadn't known her well started stopping by to say hello, planting seeds of connection that grew stronger over time. Detective Laura Hayes kept tabs on the situation from afar, ensuring everything stayed on track. She visited Mrs. Harper periodically, checking in on her progress and offering encouragement. During one visit, Mrs. Harper thanked her sincerely. "I never thought anyone would care enough to help me," she admitted. "But because of you, and everyone else, I feel like I'm finally finding my place again." Hayes smiled warmly. "You've always belonged here, Mrs. Harper. Sometimes it just takes a little effort from all sides to remind us of that." As months passed, The neighborhood transformed in subtle yet meaningful ways. Families began organizing more group activities, picnics in the park, block parties, and seasonal decorations contests that brought everyone together. Mrs. Harper attended some of these events, tentatively at first, but eventually with genuine enthusiasm. Her participation sparked conversations she'd avoided for years, allowing her to reconnect with the world around her. For the Andersons, life felt richer and more connected. Sarah realized how easy it was to judge others based on surface impressions, especially in moments of conflict. But she also learned that understanding someone's pain could turn adversaries into allies. The kids, meanwhile, embraced Mrs. Harper as part of their extended community, often running over to show her their latest drawings or inventions. In return, Mrs. Harper gifted them handmade bookmarks and stories about her childhood, a reminder that every generation has wisdom to share. By the following autumn, the neighborhood buzzed with laughter and warmth once again. Leaves crunched underfoot as children played tag, parents exchanged friendly waves, and Mrs. Harper sat on her porch, watching it all unfold with quiet contentment. Life wasn't perfect, it rarely is, but it was full of hope, resilience, and second chances. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The power of compassion to heal wounds, mend relationships, and remind everyone that no one is truly alone.